Welcome back to Concrete Play. Today we're going to talk about play depth. This is an important concept that doesn't get very much play, so I figured I would take the time and explain it. There is a certain amount of meat to any given play concept, and you have to make sure that you have enough meat for the players to enjoy without giving them so much meat that they choke to death. A good example of that is every first-person shooter game ever made. These games all have the same baseline, but they all feel very different because they have different little tweaks. For example, if you are playing an Aliens game, they generally try to focus on how scary the aliens are. And so there's a little bit of, a few mechanics that help that out, and there's a few different kinds of setups that they use to really push that terrifying feeling to the limit. They often flub it because they're largely designed by committees, and that means that they have some serious flaws. But they try, and it's obvious that that's what they're trying to explore. And similarly, if you play with Dead Space, they also want to do the horror feel, but what they do instead of aliens' unstoppable nastiness, they try to make you do precision aiming under great stress. That's a very different feel, and it ends up feeling quite different, even though they are both horror first-person shooter games. So it's important to realize the kind of difference you can get even within the same micro subgenre. But you also see a lot of more generic focuses. For example, if you're playing Halo, they decided to limit you to 2 weapons. 1 weapon, 2 weapon, and you can't carry any more than that. This sounds like a rather minor development, but it actually makes your tactical space very different than a game which has the same pacing, but allows you to pick up any number of weapons. Just by changing a constraint, they really changed how the game feels to play. Now, combining everything together wouldn't work. Even if you managed to do it, the game would have to be like 8 million hours long. So normally what happens is you focus on a particular thing that you want the player to experience, and then you make sure to pull enough meat out of that. This is something that I generally call the twist. And basically the twist is whatever concept you come up with that makes your take on the genre kind of fresh and new. For example, if you're making a JRPG and you want to use a stuck system like GameMaker, then maybe you should try very hard to make your magic something interesting and special, because magic is the thing that sets fantasy games apart normally. And there are a lot of ways that you can make your magic interesting and special within the constraints of GameMaker, or anything else, RPG Maker, whatever you're using. For example, instead of just using typical mana, you could have mana that builds up over the course of combat, or you could have, instead of spells, you draw monsters in when you've defeated them or befriended them or whatever, and absorb their power, and you can like become them, stuff like that. Those are very basic concepts, and they provide enough of a twist for you to make your game feel very interesting. But not all twists are created equal, and not all twists do what you want them to do. So the way I think of it is pretty simple. The genre, or the gameplay genre, they're slightly different, but it's basically a giant block of granite, or whatever you want to make it a block of, and it's huge. And a player comes along and sees it, and they're like, this seems interesting, I guess, but I don't really know much about it. What's going on here? And your job as a game maker is to twist. That is to say, get a drill and drill in a little bit. Drill something interesting out. And then the player can look in the little hole and see where it goes. So you have to twist, you have to come up with a twist that can drill in deep enough for the player to see someplace interesting, but you don't want them to get lost in a maze that you've drilled out. So what is a good twist and what is a bad twist? That all comes down to play depth. And I guess, or honestly speaking, there's probably no bad twists, except for ones that make the game just not work. Because you can always find some way to turn a clumsy twist into a brilliant stroke of genius by overcoming that clumsiness. And that's great. So if you have a twist in mind, the real question is, can you make it work as well as it's supposed to work? And to show you an example of a really graceful twist, I thought I would talk about the more recent XCOM game, XCOM Enemy Unknown. Now this is a pretty famous game, and if you haven't played it, I'd be a little bit surprised, but it is pretty well regarded, and it has focused itself very, very tightly on that twist. The old XCOM games were hugely dense, and the new XCOM game carved off all of that clutter and left you with a fairly bare bones approach. Later they cluttered it up again, we won't get into that, but basically the tactical engine of XCOM Enemy Unknown is very, very tight and simple, and it all comes down to what you can do during your turn. In fact, a lot of twists are what you can do during your turn. A lot of twists are based on things like initiative or action order. That's why Disgaea is so popular. It's got a really interesting initiative system combined with a... We'll get into that maybe some other day. Anyhow, this system is very, very simple. Everyone has an A action and a B action, and they have to be taken in that order. The A action is movement, and the B action is movement, gunplay, item, whatever. So basically you can move twice, or you can move once and then do something, but you can't do something and then move. And if you've ever played the game, you know that that's pretty much how it works. It's super, super simple and easy to understand. And if a new designer came up with this idea, he might think, that's kind of too easy, isn't it? It's kind of too flat. You can't get enough out of that. But here's where the XCOM devs put in a lot of extra effort, because every one of the classes messes with this formula. So for example, the snipers move the gunshot into the A system, and they can't fire after they've moved. And that means that they have a very, very heavy feel to their movements. They have to get up and like brace themselves. On the other hand, the assault team can quickly learn to fire here and here, or do other kinds of complexities like have looping B actions in certain situations. And there are a steady number of options for the heavy where they have specific extra actions they can take here. And there are other things like extending it to having a fake C action and a whole bunch of other stuff like that. So this very, very simple approach gets cluttered up over the course of the game. Now, this is a great way to think of it. This is a great way to do it. So you come up with this pretty simple little idea. There's an A and then a B action in everyone's turn. Very, very basic idea. And then what you do is you take your twist and you drill. And you uncover a little bit more, and you uncover a little bit more. And this is the best way to think of it is you want your player to see these new layers as they get used to the old layers. And that's why in XCOM you start with a team that doesn't have any special abilities. You don't start with a team that has powers or even specialties. You start with a bunch of faceless grunts that have just strictly this. And then the game introduces each of the core different specialties. And if you're playing the game for the first time, chances are pretty high that you're not going to have all four of your starting characters graduate into 4 different classes. It's going to be like one guy gets enough kills to go up a level. And so he's the person that gets the new class, and you're not inundated with 4 classes that you have to learn. You just steadily ease into it. But this is a really simple twist. It's a super simple constraint, and it works great because the devs knew that they had to make it deep. And they made it deep by taking this super simple approach and simply creating permutations of it within the game. You can do this with any twist, I think. I haven't thought of any twists I couldn't do it with, but it is important to know that you have to do it. So for example, if we were going to come up with a new magic system, and it was going to be just like all of the other magic systems out there, except you produce mana during battle, and you start with some small amount of mana. First off, realize this is not a new idea. Very few of these twists are new. It's more about the fact that they're fresh for the moment, or in the genre. But anyhow, we're talking about a game where you create mana over the course of the battle. Although creating manga over the course of the battle will be interesting too. Because of this, you have a situation where your characters have to build up a supply of mana. And that means that you have to take a couple of turns to do stuff to build up the mana. Pretty simple idea, right? Well, rather than tweaking the things that they can do with the mana, you should instead tweak the things that the mana is made of and how it comes to be. For example, you could have a class that does get to start with some mana. You can have a class that gains mana when anyone else in the party gains mana. You can have different classes that gain mana via different ideas and different techniques. One gains mana when they're injured, one gains mana when they damage the enemy, one gains mana when they kill an enemy but not when they damage them. That sort of stuff. The basic concept is very simple. Mana doesn't start at 100. It starts at 0 and it goes up as you perform actions. But by simply varying what those actions are and what those situations are, you can create a world of interesting, intricate little characters. And you want to introduce it gracefully. You want to introduce it gently so the player doesn't get too lost. You start with this idea here when mana goes up as you attack monsters, and then you get another party member and you break through that layer into the next layer, and the next party member has slightly different rules. And then you break through and maybe party member A's rules have changed a little bit and party member C has come in and they got different rules. So it's important to do that. It's important to understand that you have to create play depth out of your twist. You don't have to have a brilliant new gameplay mechanic that no one has ever thought of before. You need to have a twist that a player can explore with you. Anyway, I hope that was clear.